Hi, everybody. Good evening. Can everybody hear me? Excellent, excellent. Hello, good evening, and welcome to Cure. I'm Seema Kumar. I'm the CEO of Cure, and welcome to our beautiful facility. I may have said this a couple times before throughout the week, but I'll repeat it again because I never get tired of repeating and talking a little bit about what Cure is all about. So Cure is an innovation campus. That's what we call it. This is one full square block building, 350,000 square feet of space that is made for innovation and for advancing healthcare. So we have many residents in the company in this particular building that are working on early stage, clinical stage. We have therapeutics, we have medical devices, we have incubators, we have digital health, and all of the above. But more so than that, it's first of all, it's not just what's inside the building, but it's like beyond the walls and the people inside the building who make things happen. And so we consider ourselves to be a neutral convener, bringing together the various different aspects of the healthcare ecosystem to drive positive impact and change. And that's our goal. So our mission is simple, which is advancing healthcare, as I said. And if I had to say it in one word, what we're all about is cure. Period. And that's why our logo says Cure. What we also do, in addition to driving the research agenda and also ensuring that we are kind of pushing the status quo, having important conversations, is also about building an ecosystem. Because as we know, it takes a village, it can take an entire community, but to drive innovation, it's going to take the entire ecosystem. And so the ecosystem of healthcare needs to come together and do that. And one last thing I'll mention before I turn it over to Laura, and that is that we believe we're always sort of looking at the leading edge of what's happening in healthcare, and that's going to transform it. And we believe that AI is that thing that is going to really change things. But I know that a lot of valid concerns are there about AI and what it can do, and those are concerns that are valid. But on the other hand, like every other technology that comes along, and many of us have lived long enough to know the various different transformational technologies that have come around, that each time something like that happens, we always ask the question, is it going to do good? Or do we have to be careful about it? So we launched something called AI for Good. And AI for Good has to do with driving entrepreneurs, innovators to really apply AI to solve big problems in healthcare. And we're calling on all entrepreneurs and innovators to apply for this challenge. And the winners are going to get a 1-year residency at Cure and seed money to drive that innovation forward. So that's just an example of the kinds of things that we want to incubate. But we also believe that one of the most important things in driving the conversation and having the conversation is creating trust and communication. And I think engendering trust in science and healthcare is going to be tremendously important for us to work, as a holistic society that can have meaningful dialogue and solve some of these big healthcare challenges that we face. And so that's why it's really a pleasure to be hosting this conversation on storytelling, because facts and data and all of that can lend credibility to science, but it's the storytelling that is going to capture people's hearts and minds, and that's what it's all about. So with that, let me welcome Laura. It's really wonderful to host it. We've had long partnership with Nature, Springer, and Scientific American, so it's really a pleasure to welcome you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I can take that.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Lots of great technology.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much to Kumar. Thank you so much to Jerem for hosting us in this gorgeous space. You can dance at the end, or
which I've been a part of for a long time, and it's really nice to work together on this project. But especially welcome to all of you. It's great to see people here in person. Welcome to everybody in the audience, in the virtual audience. Thank you so much for coming. We are thrilled to have science storytellers be part of the Science Summit at the UN this year. I'm your MC for tonight. My name is Laura Helmuth. I am the editor-in-chief of Scientific American, and Scientific American is the oldest continuously published magazine in the United States. We just celebrated our 178th anniversary, so it's a big time for us. Still going strong so far. And we are published by Springer Nature. And Springer Nature Storytellers program is what's bringing us all here today in partnership with Story Collider and with UN's Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So I want to thank all our partners, all the organizers, all the staff who are here, keeping us going, keeping us fed and mic'd up, and helping the show go along. And especially again, thanks to all of you for joining us. So we are halfway through the Sustainable Development Goals timeline. Probably most of you here know that in 2015, member nations of the UN agreed to a set of 17 goals with a timeline of achieving these goals by 2030. So in the year 2023, we're halfway through, and so it's a really good time to take stock. And that's one of the reasons why the Science Summit and the other UN events this month are just really consequential. It's a really important time for the SDGs. So if you'd like to know more about the SDGs, I highly recommend there's a QR code that will be flashing where if you scan that, you can go directly to just a ton of information from Springer Nature Group about the work that we're doing, that everybody's doing to advance SDGs. So you'll find research papers, books, articles, lots of ways to get involved, and lots of really good background to go deep on any of the 17 SDGs or the program in general. So it's a great resource. And one of the things that has been posted recently is a big collection of articles from Nature looking at, where are we? How far have we done? How far have we come? What do we still have to do? Looking halfway through the SDG timeline. And as you can imagine, there's a lot left to do. On pretty much all of the goals. And today at this event, we're going to be focusing on 3 of the goals: affordable and clean energy, gender equality, and reducing inequalities. But as with anything important, it's all intersectional, and the goals all relate to one another. And so I think the things we'll be talking about tonight will also have to do with health, with education, important for justice, and partnership building. And partnerships is sort of a meta goal of this gathering. I think, we hope that one thing that will come out of this is that you'll be able to make connections with the speakers, with one another, get to meet each other, get inspired, share what you know, share your ideas, and continue the conversation off into the future. So the program for tonight, we have 3 talks to start, and then we'll have a 15-minute break or so. And then 2 more talks, and then a Q&A, and then some more mingling time. But this is very informal. If you would like to get up at any time, get a drink, get some snacks. The snacks are excellent. So I highly recommend getting some food. We need brain food to concentrate and to be strong for the mission. So yeah, please feel free. It's a very informal situation. Thank you for coming. More people will be filing in. There's, as you know, there's a lot going on this week, and traffic in New York this time of day. So there will be people coming in and out. But do stay till the end for more mingling and more snacks. We're ready to start with our first speaker. Namborli Sacafrio is an associate professor of global and intercultural studies at Miami University of Ohio. She's an expert on energy, political economy, gender, and sustainable development in sub-Saharan Africa. And she's also a science communication fellow at University of Rhode Island, Michigan State, and Storylab. So thank you for starting us off.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you. So, on one particular sunny afternoon on a Saturday, I must have been about 12 years old. I was in northern Nigeria in a city called Zaria, and my mom and I and my sister found ourselves on a bus, on an old rickety bus. And as we climbed in and we sat down and we waited for other passengers to board, I was struck by how this bus seemed on the verge of collapse. I could not believe that the busboy, who couldn't have been older than me, was still beckoning for passengers to get on. And miraculously, it was okay. And so we took off. And not long after we got on the bus, attention of all the passengers suddenly turned to the left, almost in unison. Oh, thank you. Almost in unison, everyone turned to look to the left. And I was kind of checking out the faces of everyone as everyone sort of collectively looked to the left, and I did too, and found a kind of startling sight. There was a very, very long line of cars at this gas station, at this petrol station. I had never seen anything like this. I mean, it was long, really long. And as I looked from face to face, it was a mixture of like disbelief, shock, dismay. People began to talk in the sort of local slang, which more or less translated as shock and dismay and disbelief. Some folks saying, "Oh my goodness, what is happening in Nigeria?" This was Nigeria. And I didn't understand this. Again, I was about 12 years old. And there was something about that moment that seemed huge, but I couldn't quite grasp it. Well, needless to say, shortly after seeing that, we disembarked, we got off, and we made our way through an open market where we proceeded to go to a hair salon. But on the way, it was very lively. You know, there were lots of people in this open market as we made our way towards the hair salon, and there were people selling things, selling tomatoes, bread, all the kinds of things that I wanted to eat. And I heard a lot of complaints about high prices of food items. People were complaining about different things. There were canteens, small stalls with, folks who were basically selling refrigerated drinks, and they were kind of complaining about how the light wasn't on. Like they have taken light. This was a common refrain, and I was kind of a bit puzzled. Although I did recall in a charming neighborhood that was very dear to me, a neighborhood that was filled with memories of mango trees. We had the best mango trees in the neighborhood, and cashew nut free trees, among others. But one of the memories that I have growing up is that the lights would go out. The lights would go out often, and they would go off at night a lot for whatever reason, which I always wondered about, but never quite grasped. And I remember one night the lights going out, and my mom saying, "Naborli, go and get the kerosene lamp. Go and get some candles." She told me and my sister, and as we made our way, I was asking her, "Mom, how come we don't have light? How come the lights keep going out? And how come we don't have a generator like the neighbor, across the street?" And she would just kind of shake her head. I could sort of see the glimmer of the light. By this time, I'd gotten a candle and a kerosene lamp, so I could kind of see, her face. And it was just a mixture of emotion. I couldn't really tell, but all I knew at that point was that some people had light and some people didn't, and I didn't know why, and that made me curious, especially as I began to hear a lot of complaints when we're out in public spaces about the lack of electricity. The national utility, which was called NEP at the time, which stands for National Electricity Power Authority, or Never Expect Power Always, as was the common acronym, just really garnered a lot of complaints all the time. In fact, one of the memories that I have growing up in Nigeria for the 10 formative years I was there was gathering with my family after dinner in the living room, where we would turn on the TV. We only had one station. Can you imagine? It was called National Television Authority. And I remember, my mom would turn it on, and I would look for my favorite commercial. There was this Coca-Cola commercial that I really liked. It was the 80s, and I thought, yay! And that would quickly cut to I'm not even sure how to describe it, but it was like protests, people protesting different things. I saw signs with people protesting NEPA, Never Expect Power Always, and people protesting, soaring electricity bills that they couldn't pay. People protesting, salaries that were frozen, school fees that were skyrocketing. There were all of these intersecting issues that I didn't quite understand. I was probably about 13 at this time, but because I was a professor's kid, I did have some idea of some of the connections. as my mom would sometimes give a short economics 101 lesson. But there was something about those images, in particular that evening when that evening when we sat down and we saw those faces. I mean, there was a mixture of anger, of frustration, as many people had gathered in the streets in the city that I lived in, and they were sort of exchanging, just remarks with the reporter to explain, we want this to end. And there was something about that moment that really struck me with a sense of unease, a sense of uncertainty. I didn't know what was going on. And fast forward to when my family made the very difficult decision to leave Nigeria after 10 formative years. It was around 1992. There were mounting economic challenges as well as political instability. And for personal family reasons, we had to leave. But sometime in 2004, I was starting graduate school. And I remember one afternoon reading about something horrible going on in the southeastern part of Nigeria, the Niger Delta region, the site of a lot of environmental protests, devastation, and more, and also involving a multinational oil corporation and human rights abuses. So all of this was rolled up, and I remember reading this really horrible story about communities that had been destroyed. This had followed, of course, the hanging of 8 environmental activists many years before, Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other environmental activists who were summarily executed because of their protest activities, and in particular, the sort of non-governmental organization that they formed to sort of garner support. And both of these things kind of converged for me at that moment, because I was struck by just this idea of images of charred homes, of charred grass, of destroyed flora and fauna, of oil spills that had left in its wake a devastating effect on these communities. I wonder, how can anyone live in this area? And to make things worse, the state government was doing nothing. There was very little outcry in terms of, wow, we need to do something about this. And so what I saw was really just a very repressive kind of energy that disturbed me to my very core. But what also upset me was the kind of coverage I was seeing, which I thought was one-sided and really didn't capture the multi-layered sort of aspects of what explained not only the oil curse, but endemic energy poverty, but this huge and increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots. And so there was something about, 2004, not too long after I started my PhD, that I decided that I had my spark. I was going to look into these issues. I wanted to know why, and I wanted to put pen to paper to capture what I felt were neglected aspects of what was a very, again, multi-layered and complex process. And what also was particularly sensitive for me was that lots of people would ask me about the conditions in Nigeria or other African countries. And it was, again, a sort of assumption that war and conflict were endemic. And so there was something about all of this coming together that struck a chord with me. So I thought, okay, I have this thing that I want to do. And so in around 2006, I decided that in a dissertation proposal, which was basically a rationale for why I was choosing a particular focus, I decided my focus was going to be shale oil and the environmental degradation in the region. I wanted sort of a bird's eye view, and I thought that there was something that I could contribute in a way that I hadn't quite seen the perspectives. I remember calling my mom up to tell her, those 15 minutes changed my life. I was excited. I thought, okay, I'm gonna tell her, she's gonna be happy, she's gonna approve what I'm doing. I'll get a yes from her. I call her up. I was like, Mom, are you there? She's like, yes. And I said, I have something to tell you. She's like, okay, go ahead. And then it came out. I want to go to Nigeria. I want to do field work. I want to look at what's happening with shale oil because, as you know, since we left, there's been just a lot going on. And then she quietly said, she took a deep breath. I could hear her breathing. And she said, Naborli, have you been paying attention to the news? At which I kind of chuckled like, well, of course, I'm studying to be a political scientist. Of course I've been keeping up with the news. What would that make me, right, if I wasn't? And she said, have you heard about the ransoms? Have you heard about the kidnappings of oil installation workers? Have you heard about, some of the militants, right, in the region? Because unfortunately, because of those dynamics in the Niger Delta region, which is the site of oil production, it's where Nigeria's vast oil reserves are, things had really taken a turn that not many people expected. So she asked me, are you aware of all this? I said, yes, I am. I said, I won't go to the region, but I will find a way to get, observations. I want to get a sense of public opinion about this. And she said, absolutely no, you cannot. You cannot do this. And I said, why? And I tried every angle I could think of. And at that moment, my heart began to drop. I began to feel a sense of foreboding. This was not going the way I thought. And I was trying every angle to reason with her and say, Mom, I understand. I mean, we live there. She's like, you will be considered an outsider. You can't do this. So at that moment, my dream was squashed. I mean, this was the whole reason I decided to pursue a PhD, because I was so fired up about the sense of injustice that had been done, and just to the environment, to thinking about the consequences of oil degradation, which seemed to be only told from a certain perspective. So as I heard those words, I realized that this was a final no. There was nothing I was going to do. What was I going to do? My mom had said, you can't do this in Nigeria. What am I going to do? Well, fast forward to 2007, my fortune turned, okay? I was in a taxi, it was late July, it was a hot day in late July, and I found myself where? In Ghana, okay? Another West African country, in Ghana, the capital city of Accra. Found myself in a taxi that was going really fast. By the way, weaving in and out of traffic. I thought, oh my gosh, what is this? And I tried to collect myself. Was grateful when the taxi driver turned the radio on. Whew, sigh of relief, I could now shift my attention to something else. And what I heard on the radio startled me. Here were two lively commentators talking about rolling blackouts in Ghana. Now, this was surprising to me. Blackouts, they were talking about an energy crisis. I had known, of course, prior to the visit that there were some problems, but the way that I heard this description in which these commentators were saying to one another, why are there rolling blackouts in Accra? In Accra, in the city of Accra, okay, the capital city. It made no sense. But then, as the conversation unfolded, I realized that this was much bigger, that there was something strange about this. And it gave me my first aha moment. Another aha moment would come not too long after that, as I realized that there was something here. There was an energy paradox. I couldn't study similar issues that I had wanted to do as I wanted to do in Nigeria, but here was something else. Here was something equally compelling. And I remember realizing that when I came across some data that suggested that Accra had one of the largest access rates to electricity and to energy, I felt puzzled, because I had talked to a lot of people, and I had also done some other research that suggested that there were many cases in which one half of a house had electricity and the other did not. So what explained this supposedly high rate of electricity or electrification? And that's when the who, what, why, where, and how came to me, that I thought, this is what I need to study. This is where I need to shift, and this makes sense. This is timely. The time is now. And it became the midnight oil that kept my idea of what needed and what deserved attention going. So to kind of think about where I am today in terms of the sort of the broader issues around energy, I realized that there are many intersecting elements in terms of how I grew up and how I came to understand the role of energy values. And today, what animates my focus is this idea that we all have both individual and collective energy signatures. And as an energy researcher, I'm particularly motivated by the ways in which we can harness the tools we already have, the power to change our own inner wattage, so that we discover how to truly deploy our own collective power to produce both individual and collective energy futures that are sustainable in the truest sense of the word. Thank you.
Area area of the circular economy and sustainability, and the flows of material within economic consumption production systems, and strategies for slowing and closing material loops. She's also co-author of the United Nations Environmental Program International Resource Panel publication called Redefining Value, the Manufacturing Revolution. Thanks.
I apologize in advance if I cough. Erin here has been a little bit challenging, but I'm also going to start my story when I was around 12 years old. It seems to be a pivotal moment in many people's lives. Only a very different location. I grew up in Canada, and I was outdoors all the time as a 12-year-old. There was a woodlot near my house. We rode bikes, we built forts, we explored every square inch of the swamps and the creeks and everything that was there. And this was something that my friends and I and most of the kids in our neighborhood would do every day after school, most weekends as well. There wasn't a lot of other things going on. But one day we showed up ready to go in and play capture the flag or something. And there was a work crew installing fencing. And this fencing was going to be basically around the entire perimeter, preventing us from going into our favorite place to play and explore and climb trees. And over the course of a few days, this fencing was erected and eventually had a giant sign posted on the sign announcing the arrival of a new big giant box store. The first one in my community, very pivotal. I was outraged, disbelief, defiance, ready to rally all of the children in the town to protest this. But the narrative coming from a lot of the adults in our community was excitement. There's an American retailer here, which is a big thing in our small community, but also low prices and all of these things that bring jobs and economic opportunity and access. That didn't change how I felt, though. I was still very frustrated by this loss of something that was so valuable and cherished by me and my friends. And so I would talk about this and tried to share my perspective with those who were around, and eventually they stopped listening. And that experience was one of the first major catalyzing events that I'm going to share with you. Having this awareness of something that is so wrong, you know it deep down, it violates everything that you believe and know should be happening. And you can't get anyone else to care about it. And I don't like feeling sad. I was sad and frustrated and discouraged for a little bit, but I learned that turning that into anger, some other mobilizing emotion, was really the path forward for me. So I became an activist at the age of 12, and I was very anti-box store and could talk a lot in those directions. And so all of that feeling really kind of launched me into what I did for the next 10 years, another fast-forwarding type of moment. I did my undergraduate degree, I did a graduate degree, and it was all with this intention of infiltrating big bad business. I was going to get on the inside, I was going to learn how to talk the language, I was going to be able to bring this new perspective that stakeholders and environment and community could be just as important as profit. And I was going to solve this because I had felt so alone in that moment in my community. Nobody else agreed or understood or would step into that empathy space with my frustration about what was happening. So I was going to fight this fight alone, infiltrate big bad business. I was going to fix it, figure that out. And for a while, this worked. I found myself working as a sustainability consultant. I was working with major multinational companies, especially in consumer packaged goods space, and helping them. This was around the time when companies were just starting to use the word sustainability. And we were starting to say, hey, we should talk about corporate social responsibility, and we should share our environmental impacts. And then there was you probably remember, a bit of a hesitation. Maybe we don't want to share that yet. Let's measure it first, and then we'll decide what we want to share. So that was the work that I was doing. I was working with these companies to figure out what impacts were material for their operations around the world. What was relevant for them to talk about? If they didn't use water targets didn't mean much or shouldn't mean much. Again, my goal was to make them better. So trying to steer them to pick targets that mattered and that they could improve on. And so all of this is happening. I'm feeling great about things. First of all, I have a job, which was a big deal at the time. and trying to help these companies do something good. And I felt great, check those boxes, prove to those adults, those community members who didn't listen way back when. Apparently I hold a grudge for a really long time. But I was proving something to them and to myself, because one of the stories, one of the narratives and responses that I often got was, you're being too emotional about something that's not emotional, and that this is just the way the world works. But I didn't believe that. I do not accept still today that that's the way the world has to work. It wasn't working for me. So this defiant trend kind of followed along. I do not accept that this is the way the world works. And I was trying so hard to live that in my job, helping companies do something different, be more sustainable, have a better impact than they were. And unfortunately, or fortunately actually, because this is the next catalyzing thing that happened in my life, was that I was put on a project that really forced me outside of that bubble, and I had to look in the proverbial mirror and get a glimpse of really the privileged and entitled position I held. So it was good in that sense. I learned a lot. I was working for this big multinational CPG company. They generated a lot of packaging, and they had decided that recycling was going to be their path to sustainability. That was where they were going to focus. And so on this project, our big job was to call their teams, their business units that were all around the world, and ask two major questions. The first one was, what is not working for recycling in your country? What are the problems? Why is this not happening? And then the second piece was, what can corporate head office do to help make this better? We're supposed to collect this information and come up with a big strategy, and it was going to be amazing. And I'd worked mostly in Western industrialized economies at that point, Europe, North America. So I was assuming that the responses were going to be what I typically encountered in that type of environment. People don't care, it's not convenient, it's expensive, it's confusing. But we had multiple calls with teams that were based in the Caucasus, in Southeast Asia, Central America, East Africa. And they were also struggling with recycling, but for incredibly different reasons. Some communities were struggling with the fact that they didn't have any waste management infrastructure at all. So to ask for recycling when there was nothing was not only ridiculous, but it was very frustrating for them. Because there's this big push, head office, you're going to recycle, we're going to improve recycling. Well, first maybe we could start with general waste collection. In other communities, they had once upon a time done recycling, but civil conflict and other disruptions had meant that all of that infrastructure, distribution roads and facilities had been destroyed or dismantled. And they had a much bigger challenge in front of them, which was just getting their product out into the market, let alone worrying about the packaging that was associated. But the pivotal thing for me was talking with a community that unfortunately was plagued with such low income that the people who lived there could not afford the standard size bottles of shampoo or dish soap. And so the company had been selling their product there in small pouches, little sachets, ketchup packets, single serving pouches. They were not recyclable at all. Not only that, they were very light. They easily blew out of any container. And so we saw picture after picture after picture of these things littering sidewalks in spaces that should have been green, in gardens, but also clogging waterways and ditches. We heard horrifying stories about how this interruption of the infrastructure that they did have was leading to big issues with water quality for drinking, but also even outbreaks of cholera and other waterborne diseases. Not to mention the fact that it's also landing on the beaches and in the reefs. And so that moment, I remember feeling just shame because I had not been aware. And I expected myself to know these things. So I was so ashamed that I did not think about this, of these challenges, but also really intensely aware of the fact that I was doing that thing that I had hated all of those other participants earlier in my life. I was pushing an agenda that made no sense to the communities that we were talking to. We're pushing for recycling in places that did not have basic infrastructure made no sense. How fair was it to expect communities that weren't even receiving packaging that was recyclable to then recycle? Like they weren't even getting something that they could recycle in the first place. So this massive disconnect made me very outraged, as well as ashamed. And I latched onto that. This is a problem that needs to be fixed. Run after that, so many ideas, so much that I need to learn. That was the really exciting thing, right? The catalysis. I'm going to learn this. I'm going to understand. I'm going to appreciate that not everyone comes from this privileged existence in a large urban city in Toronto, Canada, and that there's other things going on in the world. So we do what consultants do. We gather all this information. We create our reports and our recommendations, and we take it back to head office. This is what we found, and this is what we think you need to do. Right? It can't just be about recycling. It has to be about so much more. This needs to connect into strategy and design decisions, systems thinking. And they politely listened, and they were appreciative. And then at the end, they said, thank you so much for all of this. We're going to sort through it. But right now, we actually have new priorities. So this is getting shelved. We walked out of that meeting, and obviously you can tell I can bring a lot of emotion to everything I do. I was ready to figure out how we could solve this. And one of my team members came over and grabbed my arm, and I was ready to launch in like, well, what about this? What about this? And they grabbed my arm, and they're just like, geez, you have to stop caring so much. And that was probably the worst and best thing anyone could have said to me in that moment, because it forced me back into that 12-year-old moment when nobody else cared about the thing that was so clear and obvious to me. And so that was the day that I made the decision to leave. I left industry. I went back to school. I taught myself how to program, and I taught myself how to do dynamic calculus and coding, which was not my forte. I'd never done it before. I was trying to figure out if I could get through grad school without programming, which I couldn't. But the goal was that I needed to learn systems thinking. I needed to learn how all of these pieces fit together so we could understand not just a sustainability solution, but those impacts and all of the supporting systems that are needed, including behavior, including regulatory systems and policy and infrastructure. So right now, that's what I've been doing. I've been working in sustainability transitions, renewable energy, green tech, circular economy. Not what are they, what's the technical solution, but what's actually needed in the world to make that work. How could you actually take this really cool idea and have it turn into something that is adopted, that doesn't violate a community's culture, sense of self, or identity, that doesn't bulldoze the forest or create litter along the roadside? How could we actually do this and involve the people in it? So that's where I've been, doing this work, doing this research, that catalyzing moment, and it may happen again, the moment that I see something so crystal clear and no one else will have the conversation, and then just I'm going to change that. But the biggest, most important thing that I do right now that gives me hope and momentum and optimism for the future is actually not my research as much as it is going into the classroom and talking to my undergrad students, because they've been raised in this culture of disempowerment. They have also been told, this is how the world works, these are the rules. One decision, one person can't make a difference. And so now I use modeling and systems thinking and all of these other tools to show them, well, actually, that's absolutely incorrect. Every can that's recycled is one that you don't have to make again. And I can go into the technical details. That's 90% emissions reduction, and that's so many kilometers that doesn't have to be driven, and so many gallons of oil that doesn't have to be burned. We can talk about that, but more importantly is reminding them that their decisions matter and that they should have those conversations. And if the people around them aren't listening, they should find new people to talk to. And so that's what really gets me going every day. And my sincere hope for myself is that my 12-year-old self is proud of what I'm trying to do. And in 10 years, maybe I will be doing something different, but at least I've recognized the pattern and I know what gets me going. So I appreciate you listening to my story and for the invitation to be here and share this.
All right, thank you so much, Jennifer. Our third speaker is Kathleen Hancock. She is an associate professor of political science at Colorado School of Mines. She conducts research on the politics of renewable energy, and she has published on energy regionalism, hydropower as a resource curse, African regional electricity markets, renewable energy centers in West Africa, women in academia, and much more. Welcome, Kathleen. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I was fired. Yeah, really hurt. Getting fired, rejection, not good. When you go up for tenure in an academic environment, you've spent 5, 6 years doing your research, your teaching, and you make a case for yourself. And at the end of that, the university decides job for life or fired. I got that one, the fired one. My department chair had never liked me. In the first month I was there, he said, "You're a prima donna." Why? Because I had tried to negotiate for a higher salary. I didn't get it, and I got labeled a prima donna. The next month, he says to me in a scathing email, "How dare you? You have stolen an honors student from me." I didn't even know what that meant, to steal an honors student. I was distraught, so upset. Here I'm in my new job. The senior colleague has attacked me twice. So I go to him, we need to talk about this. I don't understand what happened. I know she switched advisors, but I didn't steal her. And he says, "Yes, you colluded on the weekends to take her from me." And then he said, "You made your bed, now you lie in it." And I thought, I don't know what that means, but I know it's not good. And didn't get any better. Time went on, more insults, we're not getting along. Then it got personal. I'd go in to talk to him about my research. And instead of talking about that, he says, "Your father must be so disappointed in you. You couldn't bring him a child of his bloodline."
Oh, God.
I'm like, what? Yeah, child of his bloodline. You see, that year, my husband and I had gone to China to adopt a baby girl. Beautiful baby girl, so tiny, so sweet, rosy red cheeks, so sick. Those rosy red cheeks and mellow personality were because she was really sick. Fever of 104. In less than 24 hours, we're rushing her to the hospital, distraught. We hand her over reluctantly. They rush her to the ICU. We're trying to figure out what to do, and they come rushing back out. "Here's your baby. Take her back. She has measles and pneumonia. Take her to the infectious diseases ward." Yeah, that's where we got to go. 2 weeks, we watched as the fevers came and went. And finally, the measles, I didn't know this, they worked their way down the body. And eventually, they showed on the bottoms of her feet. And that meant it was the end. We went home with our baby girl, family of 3. Now, I had asked for an extra year on my tenure clock. This is common policy in universities in the United States. And the idea is you get that extra year because you're a new parent, you need to bond, you need to stay up really late. And I was an older parent too, so I needed extra help, I thought. And this was approved, as is normal. So another year goes by, and my husband and I were ready for another child. We want 2 girls. So off we go to China again. Now this baby girl is sitting over here, all grown up. She is healthy and strong. In fact, we were so unprepared for it, we turned our backs in the hotel room to find her cruising around the furniture, and we lost track of her. Like, oh, hey, this one's a healthy one. So we take her home. We're a family of 4 now. And I asked for another year on the tenure clock. Again, this is part of the policy. This time, that department chair says, "No, you can't have it." No explanation, no reason, no appeal process. So that's it. Okay, well, get to work, doing my research, doing my thing. Time to go up for tenure. Of course, that department head did not write a nice letter for me, and he basically ruined it for me, and I get the "you're fired." Now, I was lucky. There was a university in Colorado willing to take a chance on me. And Colorado is where I grew up, so I was very excited to be going back there. And it's a world of difference. My department head loves me. She's my friend. She's my champion. She sees the injustice of what happened to me before. And she says, let's have you go up for tenure after just 1 year, because you've already got the record. You can do it. And I'm like, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. So I'm all fired up, got other champions in the department, and I go through the whole process. And up it goes, lots and lots of support. I know she's supporting me. Everything's looking good. It gets to the provost. Provost is the head of academic affairs at the university. He says, no. I'm like, wow, twice. Oh, go up twice, don't get it twice. But this time I'm not fired. I've got years on my contract. But it still hurts, right? Again, that getting fired, that rejection. So it's Colorado. What are you gonna do? You're gonna go to the mountains. So I go up to the mountaintop, seeking wisdom, clarification, how I'm gonna protect myself. Because what if tenure is just never meant to be for me? What if I go up at the end of that contract and I don't get it again? I have to prepare myself. I might have to go into the real world. That's a scary place for academics. We don't like the real world. So, but I thought, okay, I got to do this. I meditate, I do the yoga, I wander in the mountains, doing all that stuff. And I do a lot of thinking and writing. What do I love about my career? What do I not so much love? Aside from that department head from that other place. You know, what is motivating me? What at the end of the day, what legacy do I want to leave? And it comes to me, I want to work on the climate change crisis. I want to work on renewable energy. And I'm a political scientist, so the politics of renewable energy. So I come down from the mountaintop with my wisdom and I get right to work. In short order, I'm working on a project on sub-Saharan Africa. I'd been to a 2-day conference. People, engineers, business people from Africa had met with people from America in similar positions. And there had been panels all day long, happy hours, dinners, networking, I did it all. And by the end of those 2 days, I was super excited and energized, like this is really what I want to do. So I go back and I tell a colleague, this is what I'm going to do, renewable energy in Africa. He says, well, as a specialist in Africa, I can tell you that'll be easy to do because there is no renewable energy in Africa. Well, I took that as a challenge, and 2 years later, working with 30 other authors, we produced this great volume about all the really exciting stuff happening, but also the political risks. You know, this is something that I was bringing to the table. So remember that tenure thing? Yeah, so continuing my research, and now I am at the end of the contract, and it's time to go up again. All right, here we go, ready to do it again. And again, I'm feeling confident, but hey, I've been burned twice. So get all the packet together, it's moving up through the chain. And at a certain point, I know it is sitting with the provost. This doesn't happen fast. It takes several months, sitting with the provost. That's the final decision maker. And I'm walking across campus and I'm texting and walking. And then I think, geez, I just gave a lecture to my students about multitasking. I'm trying to get them off their phones, right? Get off your phone and listen to me. And I showed them a video of a woman about my age walking along on a pier, texting, and she falls into the ocean, because that's how, you know, you can't really pay attention. So I stopped, like, practice what you preach, professor. So I stopped, and I'm like just standing there texting, and up walks the provost. And he looks at me and he says, "What's the matter, professor? Can't walk and text at the same time?" And he starts laughing. And I think, oh, this is a good sign, right? A guy about to fire me would not be joking around with me. Like, he could have done a U-turn, not made eye contact, whatever. But again, I'm on edge, you just don't know. So a couple weeks go by, and we're kind of coming toward the end of semester. I'm thinking the news has to come soon. And we're in a faculty meeting. Everybody's talking about, you know, faculty stuff. And in walks the provost. That never, ever happens. And he looks at me He looks around the room. I'm just here to congratulate Kathleen on getting tenure. Oh, my face went red, tears in my eyes, so happy. I get on the phone, call my husband. He's thrilled for me. I go home. My girls are there. My husband, we all hug, jump around, excited, celebrate. They have been there for me from that journey all the way through. Continue that research in renewable energy. And now my girls are grown up. They're in university. One is studying in Korea right now. The other one is here tonight. She came down from Boston to support me. And my husband surprised me this morning by flying in from Colorado too. So that's my story.
All right, thank you so much. Oh, these stories are fantastic. So we're going to take a break now for about 10 minutes. I can't recommend the snacks highly enough. Bar's open. If you'd like to enjoy the view on the patio, it's beautiful out there. But really do, if you get a chance, talk to one another, share what you're thinking, share what you're doing. I bet you're probably all only like a degree or two of separation from one another, professionally or educationally. So thanks, everybody. And yeah, take a break for a minute. Yeah, thanks everybody for
Buzzing around in my head right now.
yeah, we'll just kind of reconvene. We've got 2 more excellent talks coming up. So I'll go ahead and introduce our next speakers, and then we'll have a conversation at the end and more mingling time. Again, this is informal. Feel free to bring drinks and snacks back to your table while we're talking. We want it to be very conversational, and we'll have a conversation with everybody once the formal speeches are once the storytellers' stories are over. So our next storyteller is Alice Wu, and she is a senior associate for science policy at the Federation of American Scientists. So she's working on climate and meta science policy. She comes from an academic research background in solar cells and nanotechnology. She's also led and collaborated on design projects in Morocco, Colombia, Kenya, and India to tackle local challenges in water, energy, food, and the environment. So welcome to Alice Wu. Thank you.
Okay, we're good. Okay. So I am the child of immigrants, and as a lot of children of immigrants can probably relate, when I was growing up, anytime I complained, my parents would sternly remind me about how lucky I had it growing up in the States. Access to education, all these various things that improved my quality of life that they didn't have when they were growing up. And my parents came to the US from China, and when I was a kid, I used to spend a lot of my summers in China, staying with my grandparents for a few months at a time. And over the years, I got to see their neighborhood and their city transformed by rapid development as China became much more technologically advanced. I used to walk and bus everywhere with my grandma, and the streets used to be full of bicycles and mopeds, but over the years, that transformed more into cars and traffic jams, and a subway line was built, and there was a new station outside of my grandma's house. And so that experience made me very interested in trying to understand technology and infrastructure. So when I went off to undergrad, I studied engineering, and I think having lived for brief amounts of time abroad, I was very interested in working in an international context. And so I got involved with Engineers Without Borders, which is an organization that matches teams of professional engineers and also students with communities in various countries around the world to work together to tackle local challenges in water, energy, food, and sustainability. And I was a freshman in college, very excited, very naive, and I wanted to put what I was learning in the classroom to work in the real world and make something that someone actually use and find useful. And so I got involved with this project in Morocco with a community named Il Gilota in the remote mountains in central Morocco. You had to drive an hour off-road to get there. And this community was far enough away from the city centers that water infrastructure had not been built out to them yet. So they were reliant upon a hand-dug well for water that would dry up in the summer. And as a result, a lot of women would have to walk an hour or more each day to go collect water from a further well in a further community. And so when we got matched with them, we were like, okay, we will work with you, and the solution will be a solar-powered water distribution system with like a machine dug well that would go much deeper, and we would be able to provide reliable access to water year round. I was very excited to put my engineering skills to the test, and as was all of my team members, but realized that in the first year or two that it would be harder than we thought. We had a lot of trouble raising money because it was a very expensive infrastructure project, and the community had been extremely excited at the beginning. They probably had more faith than they should have in a team of students, but they were very confident that we were going to show up and bring them water. And we sent small teams, but we never had enough money to actually build the entire system. And so over time, that trust kind of eroded due to this unfulfilled promise. And became harder to get them to pick up calls and to get in touch with them over WhatsApp. And luckily, in my junior year, we had a breakthrough in funding. International company sponsored us and decided to donate materials and pay for all the project expenses. So we were very excited. We were finally gonna fulfill our end of the bargain and show up this time with the actual funding to build the entire water distribution system. We put together a construction plan. We went to the review board and presented it, our plan for building everything that summer, and we were rejected. They came back and their feedback was like, this is too ambitious, the scope is too large, you all are too inexperienced, you can't do this. And it was very discouraging. At that point, I had become the program manager, so it felt like it was on my shoulders whether or not this project succeeded. And it felt like it was my incompetence standing between several hundred people and access to water. So we went back, my team and I, we dove back in, we built in all these contingency plans, we adjusted the scope, how large the water tank was going to be, et cetera, and we tried to address all the flaws that the reviewers had pointed out. I remember I was extremely stressed at this point in time. I was trying to balance schoolwork with research, with this project that I felt very emotionally attached to. I remember at the hardest, when I was like deepest in it, I was like sitting in the cafeteria thinking about how the heck I'm gonna get all of this work done. And I like broke down crying into my dinner because I didn't know how I was gonna do it. Luckily, I had a very supportive team. I was lucky I was surrounded by good people, and they helped me put things together, and we submitted our second construction plan. And this time, luckily, the reviewer approved it, and so off we went. That summer, got on a night flight, went to Morocco, had a very long car journey till I arrived at the community. I was excited to see the community members in person for the first time. They were excited to see us showing up out of nowhere and finally actually doing what we had said we would do. And construction started, and as it works with working in the real world, there's all sorts of unexpected things that come up when you're trying to build something on the job. Various technical, logistical challenges that we hadn't expected, but luckily we were able to adjust the plan and make do and find solutions to work around. The one challenge that we did not have, that we had not expected and that we did not have a good solution for was this conflict that started to arise out of the communities that we were working with. In addition to Ilgilota, the first community that we had gotten in touch with, the project ended up encompassing a separate set of households about 4 kilometers away, where we had drilled the well site because the aquifer was closer to the ground there. And these two communities had not been in contact with each other previously. They didn't have prior relationships. However, they had been amicable enough at the idea of water for everyone that they agreed to share this hypothetical water and to have the well site drilled there and then piped over to the other community. But as construction went along, tension started to arise over perceptions that, oh, maybe that other community is going to get more access to water than we will, and maybe the water won't be distributed fairly. why should they get to control the water distribution system, et cetera. All of these questions over, once the project was built, how this water was going to be shared. And I remember the most heated moment occurred down at the well site. The community members from Ilgilota had walked down. I remember I rode a tractor down with my team members, and we were participating in this conversation that was happening in Darija and Tashlayit. And I obviously could not understand anything, but we had translators trying to clue us in on what was happening and trying to mediate this conflict. But even without understanding anything, I could tell when the conversation broke down and things were going south. I remember one of the community members at the well site raised his hands at our translator. I found myself thrusting my body in between these two people, not knowing what to do, extremely overwhelmed, but knowing that I had to stave off any sort of physical conflict. And that was the moment when I realized that like what I had thought was fundamentally an engineering challenge, that was really only half of it. The other half was the social and political dimensions of once this resource is built, how will it be shared, managed equally? And I realized that the communities, these two communities had been happy to share hypothetical water, but once the water became real, it became a source of power, and it became us versus them over who would get to control this resource. And as a team of engineers, me and my team, we were not equipped to solve this problem. We didn't know how to resolve conflicts or organize communities. We did our best during that trip to try to make things simmer down, and we were able to successfully finish the project on the last day as we turned on the switch and water flowed out of the pipes and the community was celebrating and my team was also celebrating. I had this bittersweet feeling that, yes, we had succeeded in our big goal of building this entire system, but the fate was sort of up in the air. Once we left, we didn't have, I guess, a guarantee that these two communities would be able to amicably share the water moving forward. And, but I had to go. School was starting. I also didn't know how to solve this problem, so I went back to the States. And I finished up undergrad, and I went off to grad school to continue studying engineering. I was very concerned about climate change, wanted to work in renewable energy, and I was doing research on solar cells in the lab, making these tiny cells and testing them. But I was also talking to folks who were working out in the real world to see what it was like, what I wanted to do post grad school. And people were telling me that like the problem actually wasn't a technological one. We had relatively cheap solar panels by this point. We could be installing them everywhere, but there was a lack of political will. There was a lack of support from the government for these projects, and then also other barriers to them being built. And once again, I was thrown back to Morocco, where I felt like I had misdiagnosed the problem, that what I thought was fundamentally a technological problem turned out to also be a sociopolitical problem. And I realized that I had to learn how to address this other side of the problem. I had been studying engineering for so many years, but I didn't understand policy. I didn't understand socioeconomic issues. And so I was very nervous, but I ultimately decided to leave my PhD program. I took my master's, moved down to DC, and I started working in policy, in climate and clean energy policy. And it's been an extremely enlightening and also encouraging time in my life. The passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and like building momentum in this administration. It's been very exciting to see a lot of the progress that I had been worried would not happen. And it's been very, I think, gratifying to now get to work on both the science and the policy at the same time in my job. And I feel like I used to have a lot of climate anxiety, but I think it's been assuaged a little bit nowadays, now that it feels like even if the work I do is very, very tiny, at least I think I'm sort of nudging things in the right direction. And yeah, so that's where I am now.
Thank you so much, Alice. Really appreciate these stories. Our final speaker tonight is Amy Myers-Jaffe. She is director of the Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab at New York University, around the corner. She serves as director of the lab, and she teaches courses on global climate finance, clean tech innovation, and energy and climate policy. She's an expert on global energy policy, sustainability, and geopolitical risk, and the author of several books, including Energy's Digital Future. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a very different journey because I'm not a scientist. But I deal a lot with science, but a very circuitous route to it. So I'll kind of give you a little background on that. So I went to university intending to study international relations, detour. I decided that I had to study a foreign language. And I guess smartly now, because we all know the end of the story, but maybe at the time it seemed a little preposterous, because I was a Jewish woman from a small town, and I decided that I was going to study Arabic. And I have a story like my colleagues' stories, because when I finished my degree, I had a 4.2 average in my department. And we had, in my university, you had these junior papers you had to do so that you get ready for your thesis. And I had an A+ on my 2 junior papers. And I had a little difficulty more with my thesis because I had to change advisors. And they gave me a B+. And the chairman of the department sat me down. And he told me, I wasn't going to tell this part of the story, but it so fits with what everybody else is saying. He told me that because my intention was to go and get a PhD. And he told me that I was very outgoing and that would not be a good quality for a professor. Okay, and that I should become a journalist or something like that. Now, those of you who are not in academia would think that might be a compliment to say that I should be, a good journalist. But actually, in academic world, that's an insult. That's like saying you're not smart enough to be a professor because you're this, attractive woman who's very outgoing and you really can't be a professor. So why don't you pick some other field? And so I did go into journalism, actually. And the thing that was a little bit challenging for me going into journalism, with a degree in Arabic, history and language, is that you have to go back to the 80s. I had this whole thing as a personal tic, right? I'm a little bit neurotic, and so I'm always making these calculations about personal safety. When I used to live down in Greenwich Village, in the very early 80s, I would get off the subway at Astor Place instead of Bleecker Street, because there were more people who'd mug you on Bleecker Street than up in Astor Place, just to sort of, give you because now the whole neighborhood is gentrified, and so you get off anywhere. But anyway, point is, that was my calculation. So my whole life has been sort of that series of calculations like that. So I made this calculation, which of course has turned out to be completely incorrect, that if I wrote about business and finance in the Arab world, that would be safe. Unlike some of my colleagues who went into the field and wrote about terrorism or politics, where you read the stories about people who get kidnapped. Or I have one colleague whose apartment was firebombed by a government that didn't like what he was saying about their country, right? So I made this decision that I was going to write about business and that was going to be safe. And I got my big break when I was offered a job to write about oil for the Dow Jones system. So for the wire services, and then, if you had a good story, go in the journal. And I remember at the time thinking, oh my God, that would be so boring if I had to only write about oil. And this friend of mine, who was a very successful, eventually editor at the New York Times, but was also starting out, and she was at the New York Times, she said, listen, just take the job. And after 6 months, you'll say, look, I've done a good job in oil, and I'd like you to move me back to banking and finance because I'm more interested in covering financial markets, right? And so that was my plan. And I went into this job that I thought was going to be super boring. And of course, oil is ubiquitous and it's geopolitical. And like on the first day of the job, people are calling me with rumors that the head of the Soviet Union has died, and we know that because the following thing happened in oil, literally. Okay, so it was a wild ride, being a journalist writing about oil. And we have to go back to the story because, now I'm, 24 or 25 years old writing about oil. And I break at that time the biggest story in oil, that the 4 big oil companies are having a secret deal with Saudi Arabia to make a price war and lower the price of oil because there's too much oil in the market, and they're going to solve that by having this price war. And there are all these men on Wall Street, these 50-something men who are very famous in oil, and everybody's saying this story is wrong, she doesn't know what she's talking about, that can't be true. And of course, 6 months later, the then oil minister of Saudi Arabia gives a private talk in London. And he says, this woman from Dow Jones, all her stories are correct. We want to push the price of oil down to $10 a barrel. And of course, the price of oil collapsed. And then everyone in the oil world wanted to meet Amy Jaffe, right? Who was this Amy Jaffe person who had this story for 6 months, and now it turns out it's true. And so I, had different jobs, and I had a job where I used to go to the meeting of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and I would interview the ministers, and I would write stories about OPEC. And again, going back in history, I started covering this conflict between Iraq and Kuwait. And my original love was that I wanted to be sort of in diplomacy, so I feel like I'm writing about this conflict, and the foreign minister of Jordan is flying around to try to solve the conflict. And I'm at the OPEC meeting where finally Kuwait agrees that they will cut their production to make more space for the rising production of Iraq, because the Iraq-Iran war is over and Iraq wanted to have a bigger market share, but they wanted to have higher prices. And they finally make a deal, and everybody's very relieved. I'm very relieved. I fly back to the United States. I get dressed, go down to the office, get to the office, and they call me in and they're like, Iraq has invaded Kuwait. And I mean, I was literally just with people where there were people from Iraq and people from Kuwait, like having dinner together. And now all of a sudden it's all of Kuwait. I mean, I'm watching the news, and I mean, I know people there, and there are rumors that they're going to go find the people from the oil industry and kill them. These are people I'm friendly with. It was just a horrible moment. And I had this, like we were all talking about, I had this incredible moment of self-doubt. Like I had always believed, in the right to know, that if I made these things that happen in the world transparent, that bad things wouldn't happen, because you knew it wasn't something happening behind secret doors. It's like everybody knew. And now I'm realizing that maybe it was the opposite thing. Like maybe if this thing had been private and nobody knew and nobody's ego was on the line and this conflict hadn't been so big, that the war wouldn't have happened. And I couldn't really actually, I mean, it took me a little while, but I really couldn't bounce back from that. And I said, I have to get another job. And I don't want to be a journalist anymore. And also, to be quite honest, because I just told you that I'm crazy about my personal safety. I mean, I realized, because sometimes I would, break a story and the minister from that country would yell at me, and one of the ministers who used to yell at me was the minister from Iraq, who was in the card deck, right? So I realized, I mean, they could just have come to Manhattan, had someone shoot me in the head, and then you all go figure out that it was someone from Iraq, right? I realized how dangerous my job was, how dangerous oil was. And so luck would have it, Rice University was creating a public policy institute. And I was living in Houston at the time. And so I went to pitch, how journalists do a book. And so I went to pitch that I wanted to do a book on the lessons of the Gulf War. You know, what happened leading up to the conflict? What do we know? You know, what do we know about oil and conflict? And they said to me, you know, we don't want a book, but we have this study and we'd like you to, you know, help us with this study. And, you know, we'll hire you, you know, not as a professor, but we'll hire you as like a research director, you know, to help with this study. And so I start working on that study, and I'm really convinced at this point that we have to stop using oil. And, you know, then I wasn't even thinking about climate change at the time. I'm really just thinking about the fact that we're just how many wars are we going to have? You know, for this study we did at Rice, we showed that, you know, there is no military solution. Like, we could put 1,000 ships for the Navy in the Persian Gulf, and it's not going to make the oil any more secure. That the things that cause the price of oil to go up sometimes are instability inside countries that actually is created by the fact that, like you're telling the story about people fighting over the water, where you can imagine how much more of a fight in a society people can have over the money coming from oil, right? So, but then as I got to working with the scientists at Rice, I got more involved in the question of climate change. And of course, I was an oil expert. So when someone from the oil industry or some other industry or some other political leader that's connected with people from the oil industry would say something, and I was a journalist, of course, so it was partly my job to see when someone's lying or not, right? Now I'm 100% like, you know, they're explaining something to you, but that's not actually true. Here is what's true, right? And so I kept going sort of deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole of thinking about climate change, thinking about what technologies do we need to stop using oil, what are they, what would they be? And I get introduced, nanotechnology, to a scientist who was at Rice at the time, a man named Richard Smalley, who was I don't want to say, he was one of the premier scholars developing the tools to prove that matter had different principles at the nanometer scale. And Richard Smalley and I got very close. You know, we spent a lot of time talking about the energy problem, thinking about how nano might solve solar, or what other kinds of things could material science do that we couldn't do before. In energy, we threw this giant 3-day conclave with scientists from around the United States, half of whom did nanotechnology and half of whom did energy science. And we had this big program. And there's a very famous scientist also at Rice, a fellow named Neil Lane. And he was turning 70. And we decided we'd have a birthday party for him. And the birthday party would be, we would invite all these scientists to come and give talks on different things. And then we would, you know, have a dinner party and so forth. And Rick Smalley comes to me, he's very excited about the Neil Lane birthday party. And he says, I'd like to give a lecture on energy. I'm like, great. So I'm talking to the people, you know, I always get wind up, because I'm not the, you know, scientist, I always get wind up with the organizational tasks, right? So I'm organizing this, you know, agenda and the meals and all this stuff. And I'm talking to some of the other people who are, you know, working on the science panels, and I'm sending them the agenda, and I have Richard Smalley in the energy slot. And people are like, Amy, we can't have Rick Smalley talk on energy, that's not his field. And I'm like, no, you don't understand, we've been working together, he's really informed, this is what he wants to talk about. And I get a lot of pushback, and finally, because I'm not changing my mind, right? Finally, I say, well, you know, there's a whole group of us at Rice that work on energy, and we're all going to work on this talk together, you know, and I don't understand what your concerns are, and so everybody backs down. Okay, now here's the end of the story. I, of course, don't tell anything to Rick Smalley, right? And I don't tell anybody to any of the other people in the Rice group. Neil Lane never knew, nobody knows, but Smalley's down for this energy talk. I don't even ask him what he's going to say. Okay, so I show up the morning of the event, and you have to go back in time since the early 2000s. And Rick Smalley stands up and talks about distributed solar and battery storage, which at the time no one was talking about. And he gives this talk about how scientists are always trying to, you know, make a nuclear power, which, you know, discovered this giant thing, this huge facility that, you know, is going to bring energy all around the world, but that, like, the answer is for scientists to come up with a battery system that's this big instead of, enough to do a whole city, that's a really easy science problem. And he lays out some of the reasons why he thinks it's an easy science problem. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, this is why this man has a Nobel Prize. I mean, I've been working on this issue for 10 years. I never had this idea. The guy is just brilliant, right? And this is how science progresses. There are all these people. I mean, we're celebrating someone who was the head of the National Science Foundation and was a Bill Clinton science advisor. So you can imagine who's in the room. And he gets to the end of his talk and no one asks a question because they've completely dismissed the idea as being dumb. Because it isn't the big nuclear plant and all this stuff. So the punchline of the story is he worked on that. We all know the story that Tesla then went on to build those. My actual daughter, who also went to Rice University, was on the Tesla team in Australia that put in one of the first battery storage virtual power plant projects, right? So that is just one technology that really is making a big difference and will make a big difference in helping us solve climate change. There are other technologies that I've worked on when I was in California, working with the state in terms of new fuels that, not just electric cars, but fuels that we could use in airplanes or fuels that we can use in trucks, right? There are just so many technologies that we know what they are. And the public sometimes walks away from talking about how to solve climate change because everybody's told we have to make these sacrifices. But actually, there are all these really fun and interesting technologies that we could use, and they would work. And so at my center at NYU, what we're going to do is we are going to build your home, your transportation, so, you're going out at night, what you're buying to wear, what you're eating for 2050. And we're going to build it in the metaverse. So each one of you could have an avatar that's yourself, and you can go in your home in 2050 and see what appliances you have and how digital or your battery or whatever it is allowing you to live without using oil, right? And then we're going to show you when you go out to meet your friends in our world, that the vehicles that are taking you around are not using oil. And same thing with the food system, and your clothes are not going to have plastic in them anymore. I don't know, you people don't really realize probably that 60 or 70% of the material in the clothes that you wear are actually oil-based plastics. If people understood how much plastic we're in there, I always tell people, if you knew that 70% of your pajama was oil, would you feel comfortable sleeping in it? If you knew that 50% of your pajama was oil, would you feel comfortable sleeping in it? At some point, like, what's the number? 10% plastic and oil, you'd sleep in it? Like, what is the number, right? And so a lot of it is just having people think through, that it would be just as good if it didn't have that in it, right? And what's the solution in terms of how do we manufacture it? So that's my new project. That's my journey. And all stay tuned so you can get an avatar and come into this new world. Thanks very much. Oh, right, okay.
So we'll see that in the order of All right, thank you, Amy. Thanks everybody again for your great stories. So we have a few minutes to discuss among ourselves, and we'll open it up for questions if anybody wants to ask a question from the audience too. And my first question kind of follows on what Amy was saying, and that is, we've talked about affordable and sustainable energy systems. Everybody kind of has a different, a different look at that, a different area of expertise. And I wanted to ask if you could, anybody who wants to share something that gives you hope, that you think is a solution that maybe hasn't gotten as much attention as it should, that you think people should know about, that you think is something that could build towards a better energy infrastructure? It could be something small, something big. Anybody have anything spring to mind?
I will go first.
Thank you.
So it's not really so much it's a technology in the sense of the process. I've done a lot of research and work with remanufacturing, which is the idea of taking a component of a product and you actually disassemble the entire thing. You test it, you run diagnostics, you understand exactly what is not working, then you either repair it or you replace it. And through doing this, most of the time you're able to keep 80 to 90% of that product intact. You only have to sub out that additional 10%. And the cool thing about remanufacturing is in the United States, to be called remanufactured, it has to meet as new or exceed new expectations and performance. So it's basically as new or better than new, with 90% fewer materials and energy and all of those things that go along with it. And so I think we have this technology, but then as other people have mentioned, we also have this perception barrier where we think anything that's not new is not good or not quality or risky. I think so that technology is there and it's apparent everywhere. You check out Amazon Repurpose and Amazon Renewed, and they're there. It's ready for us to start using. So that's something that we can jump into today. It is not on the horizon. It's something we can do immediately.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And we should be covering that. I don't think we've covered that at Scientific American. I'm making a note. We'll follow up.
I'll throw in my 2 cents. There's been a lot of concern recently with all of the new clean energy technologies and how critical mineral dependent they are. And like the government has been really focused on how do we secure the supply chain, since a lot of it is abroad, and it's vulnerable to geopolitical tensions and other sort of international issues. And I think not enough attention is being paid to research that is ongoing to make us less dependent on critical minerals. For example, I think Tesla has recently announced that they're switching from lithium, cobalt, manganese batteries over to lithium iron phosphate batteries, and iron and phosphate are much more common materials. But to go the next step further, I think there's a battery company in China that recently announced their first demonstration facility for manufacturing sodium-ion batteries, and they've announced a contract with a German automaker. So I think it's this kind of improvement that will help make technologies cheaper and also much more sustainable, since we won't have to mine as many critical minerals.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And just to add my voice to the conversation, one thing that I think would be beneficial to look at is to look at the intermittency of renewables, like solar energy, for example, and to think about the ways that we might scale renewable energy according to need, because sometimes there are assumptions that, for example, if we just increase solar power or wind power, that will do the trick. And research has shown that, in fact, although solar and wind are certainly beneficial, it really depends on what time of day or for what appliances. So looking at how we can scale up options to sort of fit different demographic groups in the developing world would really help. And to really sort of retool how we're thinking about how to sort of operationalize that. One way to do that is to really revisit our energy values, which we can do right now by using art and imagination and as ways, as a new lens for thinking through these problems.
Beautiful. Thank you.
This is not a technology, but it's since I'm a social scientist, it fits. I'm on a couple of projects with engineers in my university to look at the role of community. So if you can make changes within a community, as opposed to having a change here, a change there, and so on, whether it's heat pumps or whatever, that you will have much greater success. And we're looking at a project now where people are in a mobile home park, so they have very strong sense of community with each other, and trying to see, will these retrofits that the engineers are doing make a real difference? Or will it be stronger with this community where they know each other and you have those sort of effects of, well, my neighbor's doing it, so I'll do it. You're all talking to each other. Maybe there's even a little competition on who can do the best and so on. So that's kind of social side, I think, is really important too.
Oh, that's great. Did you want to add anything? I mean, you kind of wrapped up with a lot of solutions.
I just, so when I was at University of California, I was on the Davis campus, and they built this thing called the West Village, which was an area where the students lived, and we had office space for faculty offices and so forth. And the whole area of that university was 100% renewable energy. And we never had any blackouts, and, we had because we worked on electric cars. People had even I had an electric car because that was what fit with what you were doing. And I think what I would say is, there's a lot of misinformation. One of the reasons you're told that, I mean, I'm not saying that anything in mining, you can have a period of time where there's a shortage if you have a disconnect between how fast manufacturing plants ramp up and like how much is investing in mining in any particular time. But we all have talked about the fact that you can recycle metals. And so therefore you can, if the price goes up, you just recycle them. And then, that's how you can be part of your supply chain. So part of this story about the fact that we have insecure supply chains for critical minerals, that's an oil industry story. See, because I would stand up in a meeting and I just told you a story about how volatile and insecure oil supply is. And then if we had 1,000 ships in the Navy trying to protect it, it's not good enough, right? So I have to create a similar story about critical minerals so that you believe that electric car is not going to solve your problem. But if you think about it logically, most Americans keep a car for actually 10 to 14 years. So if I get lithium ion or some other kind of material, Tesla's doing new materials, Ford's doing new materials. If I put those materials in your car, you are going to use them for 14 years. And then 14 years from now, this guy, J.B. Straubel, who created the battery for Tesla in his garage, is now working on a recycling company, right, to work on advancing technologies for, materials recycling for batteries. So my point to you is 14 years from now, not only are we going to hopefully take the materials from your car and recycle them, which is absolutely necessary as a waste process, right? But it's not like oil, because when you put gasoline in your car today to go home, whether you're going home from the train station or you're going home from a taxi cab or whatever, the second you put that oil in your car and you use it for 15 minutes, for a day, whatever, it's gone forever. And we have to remine again. It's not being used for 14 years and then recycled. It's just gone. So there's a false equivalency there. There's no equivalency. So I guess that would be the point I would make.
No, thank you so much. So does anybody have a quick question from the audience? Oh, we do. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Question from someone in our virtual audience is, it's common for us when talking about how we can get people to make a meaningful switch to lower carbon solutions. Oftentimes people give you 100 reasons not to take action. So how do you keep motivated, stay positive, and what advice would you give to those working in climate action for them to do the same?
Great question.
Well, just know the power of one individual. And instead of sort of casting the net too widely, to sort of think collectively about how large numbers of people perhaps don't care or don't seem to think that they have agency, just focusing on what you can do as an individual. And one of the things I love about where we're moving in terms of science and tackling climate change is that there are increasingly very creative ways to think about how we can do that. And it's not dependent on, just looking back to the past, but looking to art, to music, to so many tools that we already have as a way to harness our own, what resonates for us about the call to action. So it's really tuning into your own capacity wherever you are.
And I would like to just say, for those students and young people who come out on September 17th, say, and they're going to march for climate change here in New York City, or for people who do that at other venues, maybe it feels like no one's hearing you, but that's not actually true. Because when you go out and march, if I'm a corporation that's selling you something, and I want younger people to buy that thing, or I'm a corporation that wants to get a political deal in Washington and people are marching against me, it forces me to change what I'm doing, at least in the public domain. I have to take more action that's climate change friendly. And so it really does change what people do. Sometimes it feels like people are marching around and no one's listening, or that the people who are in the room, so to speak, I like your story, the people who are in the room are not listening, but that's not really true. We've had a lot of change, and I think that change really did come from people marching around. And so I would even, say that activism is extremely important. I mean, everybody who has the capacity and interest to study science and engineering, by all means, that's where we need you. But for other people for whom political activism and those things are motivating, you are very impactful, and you should continue to do it.
I'd like to bridge the two, if that's okay, because it's both excellent comments. The first part is I've been working with industry for a really long time, and the research I do is still really connected to what industry is doing. And so just stepping back and appreciating that 20 years ago, sustainability wasn't a word that we used. 15 years ago, there was hardly any recycling happening. 5 years ago, I couldn't use the word climate change in my proposals. So if we think about how much acceleration of interest and change has been going on in a 20-year period, or even just a 3-year period, that's what really gives me optimism. Just pause and look and see what we've accomplished, even if we're lagging behind to all these big targets that other scientists are setting. Look at what we've been able to do in such a short period. And a big part of that, to like the second point, what can you do, is to just actually look for alternatives. And a few people have mentioned they're making a climate-friendly decision does not have to involve sacrifice. It takes a Google search. What is the alternative to a plastic straw? There are thousands. There are startups everywhere that are not only investing in finding these solutions, but are counting on consumers and the public and the business supply chain to recognize the value of that. And so we need consumers to take that extra moment to think there might be an alternative to this really easy, convenient option that's advertised everywhere, and just look and see what is there. Because as I mentioned, it's not going to come up when you first search it, but Amazon Renewed is a platform, and you can find electronics and automotive parts and all of these things that are refurbished and renewed and fully guaranteed and fully warrantied. So even those simple decisions of, oh, I need to get a new vacuum cleaner, you can do that using one that is now renewed, refurbished, remanufactured, fully warranted, at a lower price. Those options are available right now. And it just takes that moment of looking for it. But those innovations actually really matter to the businesses that are trying to move us forward, because if consumers don't respond, if purchasers don't respond, if procurement people at corporations don't respond, then it's going to make it harder for the business case to actually stick. And so yeah, that's I'll step down now.
And I would just say, one of the things that makes me feel optimistic is how quickly things are changing, the same sort of thing. The example I would use from a political perspective, I would say, don't look at the federal level where the national leaders are like, Republicans are this and Democrats are that. Look at the state level. The idea that Republicans don't support renewable energy, really? Why is Texas #1 in wind and about to take over as #1 in solar? Because the prices are dropping. It's not an ideological issue at that point. When money is to be made, the ideology falls away, the partisanship falls away, and this is a plug for my book that I'm working on the changing politics of renewable energy in the United States, that the coalitions are really shifting. And also, I mean, there are things to still be concerned about, of course. In some ways, the environmental movement, which launched a lot of the renewable energy, is now pulling back, saying, oh, but not if it upsets this or that. So we have to think about biodiversity at the same time. But if we are truly in a climate crisis, which I assume everybody agrees we are in, it might be that we have to make some other kinds of sacrifices, and that's maybe not a popular thing to say, but I think it's the reality of the situation. And I think these sort of busting apart this strong partisanship, this idea that this is what Democrats do and this is what Republicans, undermines that, and we can help build these stronger coalitions in the US. And to give a plug to my engineering colleagues, they also make me feel optimistic because they are looking for solutions. They are not interested in, just complaining about what's going on now. That's their whole job, is to find solutions. And when I'm around them and when I get on projects with them, I think, yeah, we're going to be solving these things. I don't know which one it is of them that's doing which thing, but I feel like so much is happening that we're going to continue to have those innovations.
Okay. Good. Well, I want to make sure we have time for all of you to talk with the speakers individually too. There's endless. We could be here all night. Unfortunately, we can't be here all night. We could be here all night talking about this. I want to thank the speakers so much for sharing your stories, your generosity, your wisdom, your insights. This has been a wonderful evening, and thanks everybody for coming. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
That what is coming up in my head is connecting the equity with infrastructure, whether it's power or people's homes, regarding climate change. Because essentially, as these storms are getting stronger, that you're seeing that certain areas are impacted more than others. So maybe we just talk a little bit, because it's great to think about what is available in the future, and I'm looking forward to playing this game as the avatar. But I don't know how many people will actually be able to do that. So think about ways of how do we make it so that if there are sacrifices that are going to be made, that it's made across the board and not just by people who have felt that they've been supporting a certain system that hasn't been benefiting them in the first place.
So let me address that and take that on. Number one, we're going to put it in Web3. So if you have a phone, you're going to be able to make an avatar and see it flat. But I think the important thing is we have systemic racism, at least we're just talking the United States, but even globally, there's systemic societal problems that Alice referred to in different locations. And in this country, literally, people were told that they could only live in this part of the city and not in another part of the city. And so you have communities that are living in less desirable sections of a place, maybe because it's very low lying and it did flood, or maybe because they put all the polluting industrial plants that are dangerous next to those communities, right? And we have to rebalance that. And I think that, just saying we have the Justice 40 initiative, that is actually not good enough, because even when we talk about putting clean energy jobs somewhere, if we're, I mean, just to give you an example in point, we're talking about a technology called direct air capture, where I can use giant fans and filters and some kind of, absorbent material to hold the carbon. And the place that we're doing the first experimental projects in those communities are actually a community in Louisiana and a community in coastal South Texas. So some of the communities that are going to be near these projects don't want them. And to your point, they don't want them for two reasons. One, because, don't do this experimental thing where I live, right? But number two, and more importantly, it happens to be a technology that some people are saying would extend the runway for how long an oil facility could be still operating. And if I'm living in a community where I'm already suffering from the fact that there's some kind of industrial plant already there, and you're telling me you're going to discover some new technology that means that plant can stay open, you know, I get other concerns about that plant, right? So I do think we really need to think about who's included in this story. You know, the problem with the stimulus in 2009 is, honestly, if you analyze where the money went, a lot of the money went to the West Coast. And we have a lot of people in this country who live in other places, right? So we really need to focus on where we place things, you know, who accepts them. How, if we're putting a facility, so how do we retire a facility in a way that makes it safe to refurbish that land? But more importantly, we need to think about energy justice. So don't be telling me that there's no way to provide electricity or air conditioning in a particular community, which in the end going to mean people are going to die, right? I need to come up with a fair system. I need definitions for who, you know, qualifies for assistance when it comes to air conditioning. I believe in this country, no utility should be allowed to turn off the electricity for air conditioning if a family even has it, and we should be thinking about how to provide equitable, you know, cooling and heating. So we're having those conversations, but we're not having them in a proactive enough way. We're saying, oh, we're going to allocate this amount of money to hand it out, but we're not thinking about it in a systematic way about how we're going to redress that. And when people say to me that, like, it's somehow people's fault in New Orleans that they lived in a low-lying area, you know, and we shouldn't be forced to spend the money to help them relocate. Well, people were forced to live in certain places, and now the community's there. So if we do need to relocate that community, that is a burden that society should take and pay for, right? So I do think it requires a whole, just like you're saying, it requires a whole different way of thinking about the problem. And that has to be part of the dialogue.
So yeah, let's keep talking about this. We have the room for a little bit, just a little bit longer, unless anybody wants to make another formal response to that question.
I just have a quick kind of, I feel somewhat optimistic about the energy justice approach because Tony Reams, who's a professor who's written quite a bit about energy justice in the United States specifically, is now in the administration. So he was pulled up into the administration to try to take his knowledge, his interests, and bring it across the federal level. His research found that a lot of people will say, well, people of color don't have solar because of an income. It's an issue about income. But his research showed that when you hold income constant, we still have a difference in ethnic and racial groups. It turns out Asian families are the most likely to have solar, and then white, and then Black and Hispanic. So just that kind of research, which it turns out, by the way, I did this massive literature review of energy justice. Most of it was being done by the Europeans who don't talk about race. Like, it's actually in many countries in Europe, you're not allowed to collect data on race because of that whole Nazi thing. So they basically can't make those same analyses. And so having Americans now being much more involved in trying to understand energy justice from a racial lens and ethnic lens is really important. So I just think the fact that we are suddenly, finally getting into it is really important. At the same time, there are some people who just thought, well, renewable energy is so nice and wonderful, it will naturally fix the injustices. That does not happen on its own. So we will have to continue to be on top of it all the time. But at least with this administration, we've made some strides, and I hope we continue down that path.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks again to our speakers. And yeah, let's talk some more informally. Really good to have you all here. Appreciate you sharing everything. Thanks again to the organizers, to Story Collider, Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Springer Nature, Cure, and to all of you for coming, and to everybody online. Good to see you all.